Our God and our Father in heaven, we are thankful for the time to be here together. We're thankful to be your children. We praise you as our God. We ask that you bless our study tonight. We ask that you open our minds and open our hearts to the truth of your word. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, this is week 8 of 13. And I'm going to handle tonight a little bit different, 2 distinct sections tonight. The first is brief. I will wrap up our thought process around ancient Israel and the state and the concept of state, tying that into social, cultural, and as we've looked at a lot, we haven't used the term government or political, but a lot of this has been their concept of politics throughout, starting with the patriarchs, then as they became a liberated nation through the Exodus coming out of Egypt, time in the wilderness, the concept of the law being developed at that point, and then how Israel then manifested that law, put it into practice, eventually asking for a physical earthly king rather than allowing God as intended, allowing God to continue to be their king and operating under a theocracy. They changed their point of view, became a monarchy, and then, as we've looked at with Saul, David hit the high note, and then the first half of Solomon's reign was pretty good. Second half of Solomon's reign, the wheels just came off the bus, and then it was downhill from there, pretty much. So first part of tonight will be to wrap up that line of thinking, looking briefly at Israel. By this time, Israel and Judah going into exile, and then again briefly what happens after the exile, particularly of Judah, the southern kingdom, coming out of Babylon after a 70-year exile, and apparently they learned their lesson, right, after that. And then second, I want to try to consolidate the last 4 weeks into some thoughts that I want to share with you as a way of preparing for next week. And this is your homework assignment, right? We cannot think about social and cultural factors without eventually having to ask ourselves what social and cultural factors are in play for us. And I mean that across a broad range of where it might apply, particularly, and I want to focus on the cultural, right? Remember, cultural is a little more of a big picture view. Cultural is thinking about the attitudes and beliefs, the value system that serves as the very foundation for a group, be it a nation, a people, a society, a church, a family. So now you see, I want us to think about how that culture, the concept of culture, would apply. And this is your homework for next week. Start thinking about the concept of culture across all of the groups that you may be associated with. Again, nationally, locally, family, church. What really is the culture that's driving then the social institutions that get put into play, the mechanism there in terms of how we, again, across all of those different groups, how we might put our society into practice. But the underlying foundation is that concept of culture. And so I'll give you some insight up front, and then we'll dig into the specifics of continuing to look at ancient Israel. But think about this. Were you to have asked ancient Israel, what is your culture? I suspect you would have had as many people tell you we're a godly culture, we're a religious culture, as who wouldn't have. And the reason I say that is that they must have known what that culture was intended to have been all along. Right? They knew their history. They knew from where they came from. So if you pressed them hard enough, I really think that eventually they would have gotten back to that original point. Abraham having been called out, the patriarchs living based on a promise from God, understanding this idea of being called out as we've recognized, this, and tying that to being holy, that is set apart for a purpose. They would have known their history for the few hundred years between the Exodus and when Saul became king. So again, I suspect if you were to have asked them and maybe had to prod a little bit, they would have eventually come around to recognize at some level the culture it represents a religious foundation. Never mind what the evidence showed. You see the tension that we're building here? And you understand how when I say start thinking about our culture, you understand the tension that I'm trying to help you see as you consider that question for next week. Because it's that tension that ultimately forces us to either be honest with ourselves or not. It would have been the same tension that would have required Israel to be honest with itself or not. And that's what I want us to wrestle with next week. I'm not going to prepare a lot for next week. I'm going to open the question. What is our culture? Let's be honest. What is that culture? What do we need to do to make that culture align with God's intent, for example? See where I'm going? See where I want us to go? Very big picture questions. So, if you were to ask us, do we have a God-fearing culture? And I mean that in the truest sense of fearing God as we're instructed in the Bible. Are we a biblically based culture? I don't know. I'm not trying to lead the conversation one way or another, but those are the kinds of things I want you to start thinking about. All right? And again, I want to stress, I mean thinking about that honestly. Really honestly. All right, 2 Kings chapter 17. We'll go through this pretty quickly. 2 Kings chapter 17. Verse 1. Hosea becomes king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Verse 2. I wish I had a nickel for every time this is written. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 3. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, demanded that tribute be paid. It's extortion. Verse 4, Hosea reached the point where he was paying the tribute ultimately to the king of Egypt. So, that's the name, S-O. But no longer paying the tribute to Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. Shalmaneser then responded by invading Israel, besieging it for 3 years. This is verse 5. Israel finally fell, and the Israelites were carried away into captivity into Syria. 2 Kings 17, verses 7 through 18 explains why. And there actually are a lot of reasons, often summed up as, persistent, I'm paraphrasing, but a persistent failure to obey God, the high places that had been established, and then God in the text often relates it back to idolatry of some type, right? The other sins are there, and they are recognized, but the idolatry is so often called out specifically. And that catches my attention because it ties back to, the basis of the entire law for them. Greatest commandment, we call it. Love God, love other people. It ties back to the tablets that Moses received from God with the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 1. Thou shalt not have other gods. Thou shalt not make any idols, graven images, right? It's what God told them right up front. And that's why I think in the text, it always comes back to they sinned. One of those sins, most often mentioned, is the sin of idolatry. So then, interestingly, well, let me finish the thought here. Israel fell to the Assyrians in 721 BC, to put a timestamp on it. And then we get to 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 19. Right? So right after, we're told that the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. Verse 19, Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. So maybe Judah wasn't quite so far down the line as Israel, but directionally it's all the same. Now, ultimately, Judah's sins lead them to be taken into exile by Babylon. But I want to point out, as you get into 2 Kings chapter 18, there's a couple of bright spots here. So chapter 18, verses 1 through 3, tells us that Hezekiah becomes king of Judah. In fact, he was king when Assyria besieged and took Israel. 2 Kings chapter 22, Josiah becomes king, and both Hezekiah and Josiah are recognized as one of the few kings that actually did right in the sight of the Lord. In fact, if you read 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, right, and I'll summarize here, but Josiah really attempts to bring Judah back to God through various reforms. The temple gets rebuilt. The high places and altars get destroyed, which the previous kings had erected to other gods. Josiah reinstates the Passover. So Josiah is really working to bring Israel back. But then we also read, as you continue through chapter 23, through 2 Kings 24, verse 9, the kings who followed Josiah, including his own sons, went back to the old ways and did evil, what was in the sight of the Lord. So in spite of Hezekiah and Josiah's obedience, God knew that ultimately Judah was a lost cause. And it ties this back, actually, specifically ties it back to the reign of Manasseh. So if you go to 2 Kings 21, verses 8 and 9. 2 Kings 21, verses 8 and 9. And I will not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more out of the land that I gave to their fathers, if only they will be careful to do according to all that I have commanded them, and according to all the law that my servant Moses commanded them. Verse 9. But they did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the nations had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. Think about how far Israel, and here I mean collectively Judah and Israel, think about how far they had actually fallen. Right? And that's why I point out specifically verse 9. Right? That's why I chose to read it specifically, because it tells us just how bad things had become. As the charge that was given to the Israelites as they were on the banks of the Jordan River looking over into the Promised Land, the charge was completely destroy the inhabitants of this land. You do that, you get the land. You do that, you enjoy the bounty. Of course, we know that they didn't completely destroy. And that, I think, become part of the starting point for all of the troubles that they've had since, up to this point. But Israel had fallen so far that now we have Manasseh as king, committing sins so egregious that God considers them worse than the original inhabitants that they were told to drive out. And God told them, I'm giving you this land not because of your righteousness, but because of the evil of the inhabitants that are already there. This is a big deal. It's a really big deal. It's a really big deal. But God knew, I think God understood that lasting obedience in spite of Hezekiah, in spite of Josiah, lasting obedience was not possible. And so God stepped in with this discipline effort with the exile to Babylon. So 135 years after Israel fell to Assyria, Judah fell to Babylon. So that puts us around 586 BC. At this point, the idea or the discussion of social, cultural, political relative to ancient Egypt sort of stops, right? Because ancient ancient Israel no longer exists. There may be pockets, right? There may be a yearning for the good old days, but practically speaking, they just didn't exist anymore. God said it will be as if you were never there, and that's in fact what happened. So let's get to 2 Kings chapter 24. Starting in verse 10, I'm not going to read because it would be a lengthy reading to be done publicly, but beginning in 2 Kings 24, verse 10, this is where the text records for us how Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, besieged the city, Jerusalem. And in doing so, this was over a period of several years actually, but in doing so, Nebuchadnezzar took into exile the officials, the men of valor is the exact word that's used in the ESV. What that means is the important people. People with power, people with wealth, people with, intellect. He took the good people. And the poor people were left behind. Actually happened in two phases, like I say, over a period of several years. 2 Kings 24 gives us a count. I'm looking at verse 14, for example. He carried away all Jerusalem and all the officials and all the mighty men of valor, 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and the smiths. None remained except the poorest people of the land. So Nebuchadnezzar took the people that could help him continue to build his kingdom, Babylon. Here's what strikes me. I'm going to insert my word, not the text, so understand. But based on the people that and the skill sets that these people represented, not only were they in exile, but it had to cross their minds, Well, this is like being enslaved. I mean, this is kind of where we started. This is what it felt like in Egypt. And then through chapter 25, we see that Judah finally completely falls to Nebuchadnezzar. He continued to take the best of the inhabitants of Judah, and then in chapter 25, verse 6, then he captured the king and brought him up to the king of Babylon, and they passed sentence on him. They slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes and put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him in chains, and took him to Babylon. Judah, southern kingdom, no longer exists. There is no social and cultural discussion to be had at this point. Now, here's where, ultimately we would pick up in the book of Daniel, for example. The prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah were active at around this time. So there's a lot within those books that we could turn to give us a little more insight and some color into what's happening here and what we read in 2 Kings. There's also some references in both of the books of Chronicles. So there's more information we could bring in, but I think you get the point. I think you get the point. I think it's interesting, and I would love to be able to sit down with those poor people, the vine dressers, as the ESV refers to them. Basically, it's the people who work the fields. The lowest in society, the people who work the fields, the manual laborers. But I would love to be able to sit down and ask them their point of view. Because in my mind, I want to relate that group back to the faithful 7,000 that had been referenced earlier. And God recognized that as bad as things were across the northern and southern kingdoms, at this point still Israel, there were still a small faithful group. And I wonder if maybe some of these that were left behind, as poor as their conditions probably were. I wonder if that's a way of God recognizing their continued faithfulness. There's always this remnant. And that takes me to, the dream, for example, that Daniel interpreted. The stone that crashes into the statue and destroys it. The head of gold, the chest of silver, the legs of iron, the feet of mixed iron and clay. The stone that crashes in and destroys that. But that stone, as we know, represents the church. And there will always be a remnant. So I want to get that thought in there as you begin to think about our conversation next week, right? And from a cultural standpoint, at a church level, do we think of ourselves as bad as it gets? Are we dedicated to maintaining that culture, that set of attitudes and values that preserve God's kingdom here on earth? Right? So hopefully that gives you a little bit of additional insight into how honest I want the conversations to be next week, and how honest we have to be with ourselves, and how specific I want the conversations to be next week. So in 1 Kings 9, 1 through 9, let's go back. 1 Kings 9. One through 9. This is worth reading. As soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house that you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And as you know, if you walk before me, as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you turn aside from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them, and the house that I have consecrated for my name I will cast out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone passing by it will be astonished and will hiss, and they will say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt, laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. Again, I suspect that if you pressed any of the ancient Israelites, they knew their history. And if you pressed them hard enough, they would eventually come around to say, you're right. God said this. This was the promise that was made. Now, why they chose to abandon that promise, that's a conversation for a different time. They either gave in to temptation and just fell away, or maybe they made a more intentional decision to go their own way and abandon what God had promised them. I don't know. I don't have enough information myself in my readings from the text to understand the specific motivations. But I take us back to 1 Kings chapter 9 to help us understand really how far Israel had actually fallen. And then if you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, I'll just mention that for reference because I want to save a little bit of time for later. If you go to 2 Chronicles chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, it tells us that Solomon's wealth, ironically, ended up in Egypt. So all of the wealth that the Israelites had when they came out of Egypt, plus everything that Solomon had built, all of the wealth he had accumulated. And in doing some readings, we're talking estimates of hundreds of tons of gold. 400 tons of gold-ish. It ended up back in Egypt. I mean, that's adding insult to injury. So Jeremiah chapter 25, verses 9 through 12 confirms for us that Judah remained in captivity for 70 years. And then we know the rest of the story. After that 70 years, a portion of Judah returned to Jerusalem. The temple was rebuilt, book of Ezra. The wall was rebuilt, book of Nehemiah. They should do a Lads to Leaders thing on, it's just. The wall was rebuilt, the book of Nehemiah. And clearly God's intended social and cultural order was at least on the road to being renewed. Right? At this point, those that returned, the discipline that God applied seemed to have worked. Now we know by the time of Christ, the concept of worship had changed. The Pharisees had largely, taken over, and the law as it was intended got twisted into all sorts of ways that God never intended. And clearly the concept of Israel being God's chosen people and the law serving the purpose that it was intended, clearly all of that had gotten lost again by the time of Christ. All right, let me pause here. Any questions or comments to add?
I think there's one thing we need to think about with this going into next week's lesson too, is why in the New Testament were we told to use this as a study for us? Because look at us today. Today I was reading an article that the two largest denominations in the USA is the Southern Baptist and the First Presbyterian. They lost over 2,000 congregations last year, sold the buildings out. They started, and less than that, started all the other religious groups put together, started less than that in churches. And that's a whole lot about what we're reading here. It's a slow item because this took years for all this to take place. So we need to take the Old Testament to heart as we're studying it and say, am I one of those that's going to let that happen?
So if you couldn't hear Joe, he's recognizing that as a nation, as a society, we clearly seem to be losing our reverence for God. And he's recognizing that some of the denominations are closing churches in terms of thousands of individual congregations. And that should be telling us something. And by going back and learning the lessons that should be learned, God included this text for a reason. Going back and really digging into and learning those lessons should be important. There are lessons there to learn. And so as you think about next week, start to grapple with, right? What are those lessons and what is our response? What should our response be? And that's always, let me camp there just a second, right? As we've often recognized in our study with ancient Israel, there was always the intended social or the intended cultural, the intended political versus what happened in real life. And we see often those didn't line up. So I suspect, Joe, that's going to enter in our conversations a lot next week. What was intended versus what do we actually have, right? Matt?
You leave God's word or God's law and you try to make God fit into what you want as the law. That's when you run into problems.
Okay, so I knew somebody was going to bring that up. There's a problem when you take God's word, God's law, and try to fit it into what you want or how you want to interpret it rather than allowing the truth to exist on its own merit. I knew that would come up, and I'm looking forward to us as a group digging into that. Because in my head, that may be an indication of idolatry, the idol being ourselves. And that's now one other piece I wanted to leave you with tonight, right? And where I was trying to go a little bit with saying, recognize that ancient Israel probably would have thought of themselves as religious people. Understand, I'm going to choose my words, but understand the intent here. Ancient Egypt thought of themselves as religious people. Ancient Israel thought of themselves as religious people. They all had their version of their gods. What I struggle with is, as a society, have we fallen so far we don't even have gods? True gods or false gods. We don't even have gods, except maybe ourselves. That's in my mind, that's a really hard problem to solve for. Again, just insight into what I hope we can try to wrestle with next week. Any other comments? No, it's you. Go
All
ahead.
right, good.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Israel and Judah did, apostasy, right? Where they were so self-seeking that they grabbed every god that they thought could profit them. They already had wealth, well, some did, right? But they wanted to be mighty above all. But they also wanted themselves to be mighty in their own social, and that own apostasy allowed them to take God, who was their wall, who was their fence, who was their protection, and gradually take it down because they stopped looking to God, which left themselves open and vulnerable to everything. God's wrath being one of them.
But why did they take those walls down? Because they believed in themselves.
Right. It's...
And then how does that fit in? How does a democracy, a form of government that emphasizes the importance of the individual, how does that now fit with what God and Israel interacted?
Right? It's not a competition, but if it were, Harry and Mark would get the gold star, right? Because they are getting exactly, it's not the only cultural concept we could talk about, but they are getting exactly to the heart of the conversation I want to have next week, right? It's a cultural conversation. So, formalize your thoughts.
I'll write an essay.
Oh, great, it's an essay. All right, let me shift gears. Were you scratching your nose, or did you have something to say?
One of the things that I have thought about and read several times where everyone did what was right in their own eyes, not doing what God said. And it led them to the point where they said, we want to get rid of God as the person we are to follow. We want to be like everybody else. Mm-hmm. When you look at us, we don't want us to be seen as anybody different from what you see with the other countries, the other cultures. Whereas, like you had mentioned, the king out of Egypt, they were trying to get out of slavery. God brought them out and provided everything they could possibly need. But we want to do it our way. And
Exactly.
I thought that has been one of the things when you mentioned today. That's exactly what we hear being preached at us from the world on one side and the other. Do what everything is the me generation.
Yeah. I mean, everything from how they sell toothpaste to us to how we do religion. Yeah. All right. Let's wrap up. So, if you've been paying attention, you'll have noticed that I've been asking you to always think about big picture, right? We've referred back to the text where it could help guide that conversation, but that conversation has always been intentionally framed to force us to think in terms of what is the big picture? I mean, the idea of culture, when you ask what is your culture, that is, by definition, a big picture question. So I want next week's discussion to be based on the big picture point of view first, and then we can dig into the specifics as time permits. We've already touched on this, but I want us to think about how so much of our discussion has been what was intended, what did God intend versus what actually happened, right? We've already talked about that. I won't spend too much time on there. But, to recognize that if ancient Israel is a proxy for us, right? If they're an analog for who we are, let's just say as a church, right? Then the questions you could ask about ancient Israel: did Israel choose to identify as God's chosen people? Did Israel choose to put their faith in God's promises? Did Israel choose to commit themselves to obeying God's commands? Did Israel choose to be different by design from the other nations? What you were saying. Did Israel dedicate themselves to ensuring that the knowledge of God and his commandments get passed from one generation to the next? That was last week's conversation. Did Israel's kings submit themselves to God and God's purpose? Did Israel as a nation choose to submit themselves generally to God? All right. Mark?
Answer yes and no to all of those questions.
Well, that's what makes it hard, doesn't it? Yes and no. Sometimes they did it better than others. Here's where I'm going, because I'm really up against the clock. If you take those questions and just insert your name, our nation, our church, the church, if you insert those specifics in our modern day in place of Israel, then you could ask those same questions, and I want us to ask those same kinds of questions next week. So I wrote those questions very specifically. Did Israel choose? And here's what I'll leave you with. What is Israel's culture? Or what was ancient Israel's culture? It was whatever they chose for it to be. That's consistent with how God interacted all along. Eve chose to sin. Adam chose to sin. Abraham chose to obey God to the point of raising a knife to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And then God stopped him. But Isaac chose to obey. Ananias and Sapphira chose to lie. So what was Israel's culture? It's whatever they chose for it to be. What is our culture? I would argue it's whatever we choose for it to be. And that's where I'll leave it for tonight. Are we clear on the expectations for next week? Because I'm planning not to say a whole lot, which may be a blessing. I don't know. You tell me. All right. If that's it, then we're done. Thank you.